Hello and welcome to Theory in Crisis, a seminar series that I've developed with the University of London Institute in Paris. My name is Eugene Brennan, and today I'm really delighted to welcome Achille Mbembe, who'll be speaking about his latest book from Éditions La Découverte, Brutalism, with a talk entitled Notes on Brutalism. So before I introduce and hand you over to Achille, I'm going to say a few words about the seminar series and some of the thinking behind it. So the title of this series refers to what it means to do critical work in times of crisis, but also how critical theory itself finds itself in a position of crisis as regards to its role today. While there have been well-founded critiques of critical theory for having apparently run out of steam, or calls to turn towards post-critique, I argue that a useful position to start from is the recognition that crisis has generated extremely creative ways of responding to these sorts of dilemmas. In other words, the starting point for the series is the idea that a meaningful critical theory of the present is necessarily a crisis theory, both because of the urgency of the political challenges around us, as well as the fact that actors and theorists continue to mount extremely creative responses. So with that in mind, I suggested three broad avenues to explore for this series. Firstly, state management of crisis. As contemporary nation states seem less capable and certainly less willing to make the sorts of democratic and economic compromises we once saw, they've become more interventionist in other ways, particularly in the forms of militarized policing and racialization. I think here of Stuart Hall's work, Policing the Crisis, and early attempts to map the forms of racialization that take place as states pursue authoritarian populisms in response to the crises underpinning the neoliberal turn. In this sense, I'm particularly interested with this series in how we can strengthen our understanding of the relationship between race, class, and political economic crisis. Today's speaker, Achille Mbembe, has put forward a thesis of a becoming black of the world to suggest that the conditions suffered by slaves in the transatlantic slave trades could become generalized in the 21st century, at least for the world's subaltern peoples. As more and more people are viewed as surplus to the requirements of labor markets, colonial tactics have been returning with greater brutality, a means through which power manages crisis. With Achille's new book, Brutalism, he offers a related but even more elaborate and capacious theorization of global capitalism's renewed dependence upon colonial forms of governance, going further in articulating the stakes of these questions in relationship to digital and technological acceleration. So all of this brutal coloniality and crisis management opens up a second line of inquiry for the series, which is, how do actors respond to crisis? How do they create possibility out of constraints? Crisis theory is not merely a catastrophic determinism, but the historical consciousness that some forms of action are less effective than others in changing circumstances. The outcome of crisis is never inevitable. As Stuart Hall argued with Bill Schwartz, it's rather determined through struggle. In this sense, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work has been particularly illuminating for her demonstration of how crisis articulates real limits as well as real possibilities. I also think of Deborah Cowan's work on logistics and counter-logistical struggles in mapping how capitalism's reorganization and weaponization of trade routes and supply chains went hand in hand with workers blocking strategic points of circulation, or indigenous movements bringing economic activity to a halt via different but related strategies of disrupting circulation. Achille Mbembe's work is also particularly attentive to the improvisational possibilities discovered by actors in times of constraints. When faced with a becoming black of the world, he has suggested that we re-examine the survival strategies of fugitivity and opacity as developed by the Black radical tradition. In the face of the brutalism mapped in his latest book, he he's outlined the compelling arguments for a new planetary politics based on repair or reparation. Finally, then, a third avenue for this series is more methodological, and that is to ask, what is the role of theory? How does it situate itself in relation to or be of any use to social movements today? In particular, there's a lot of ongoing work about temporality, how we periodize crisis, something Alberto Toscano developed with an interesting intervention in our first seminar in this series. Again, Achille's work offers impressive theorizations in various forms of our present political moments, but it also asks us to rethink the very methodologies we use to theorize. Achille draws upon African philosophical traditions to challenge persistent Eurocentric reflexes in critical theory. And Achille also draws upon the resources of decolonial thought to reconsider our very relationship to knowledge, to challenge the kind of reproduction of colonial property relations within our practices of knowledge production. So we're incredibly honored then to have Achille here today to talk about his latest work, which I've been suggesting it's a work that is unflinching in looking at the world today in all its brutality, but also offers a number of hopeful critical avenues for thinking about paths of resistance in difficult times. So a final few pieces of housekeeping before I hand you over to Achille. First of all, in regards to the series, just to say or reiterate my thanks to Alberto Toscano, who started the series last month with a talk on fascist times. Alberto's talk is available on our YouTube channel, the ULIP YouTube channel, and Alberto subsequently published a really interesting essay for the Boston Review called The Long Shadow of Racial Fascism, which takes up issues we discussed last month. Please stay tuned for future sessions in this series. In January, the next seminar will be with Deborah Cowan. February, Etienne Balibar. March with Benjamin Noyce, and other speakers to confirm before the end of the year. For today, then, hopefully you'll be able to see a chat box on your screen in which you can enter questions. And we'll have a Q&A session after Achille's talk in which I'll moderate and pose some of your questions to Achille. So Achille Mbembe then is a research professor in history and politics at the Winston Institute for Social and Economic Research, Johannesburg, South Africa. He's the author of many books I've already mentioned and many more I could go through, but I think we'd be here for a very long time. He's got a vast list of publications, but the most recent being Brutalism, and then a new one in English that's coming out, Out of the Dark Night, Essays on Decolonization, including other famous works such as Necropolitics and Critique of Black Reason. So I'm really delighted to hand you over to Achille now. Achille, I think you're on mute.
Yes. Now I would like to thank you for the invitation. I was discussing with Eugene just before all of this started, and I was telling him that this is the season of storms in Johannesburg, and I hope that we will be able to conduct our seminar without interruption from natural forces. Let me start by making what is maybe a trivial statement, which has to do with the fact that as far as some of us are concerned, in particular those of us working from these parts of the world, Global South or whatever, theory has not run out of steam. In fact, theory is needed more than ever before. It all depends, of course, on what kind of theory. But it seems to me that at least two questions confront us today. And they might well haunt us for most of this century. The first is the question of planetary habitability. It's really at the core of what I try to do in the book Eugene told you about, which is called in French, Brutalism. Came out at the beginning of this year, just before we went into confinement because of COVID-19. So that's the first question. And it's not a Southern question. It's not a European question or an American question. It is a question for the world at large. The second, which will also haunt us for most of this century, is that of life futures. And inevitably, the future of reason and the future of freedom. It seems to me that we are called upon to grapple with these very urgent issues, urgent in the sense that they are with us. We can't wait. There's no room for deferring them. We are called upon to grapple with them at a time when humanity, and I insist in using that old-fashioned term, knowing full well that to some extent it hides many different situations, historical conditions, and all of that, but I use it. At a time, therefore, when humanity seems to be coming to the realization that absent a significant adjustment to how we conduct our lives, parts of the earth will likely become inhospitable to life in the near future. And in fact, many more than we imagine, many are wondering how we should inhabit anew and share, inhabitation and sharing, share as equitably as possible a planet whose life support system has been so severely damaged by human activities, and that planet in dire need of repair. So they are wondering how, in view of the deep state of fragmentation of the planet, how should we remember it? And when I say remember it, I mean putting back together its different parts, reassembling it, reconstituting it as an integrated system in which humans and non-humans, physical, chemical, biological components, oceans, atmosphere, land, surface, are all interlinked in a kind of grand gesture of biosymbiosis and mutuality. So it seems to me that these questions of habitability, of biosymbiosis, these questions of sustainability and durability, these questions of the interlacing of human history and Earth's history, these questions are far from abstract concerns. In fact, the ongoing long-term planetary environmental changes have only further dramatized them. And there's little doubt that they will be at the center of any debate on the future of life and the future of reason in this century. So to that extent, a certain kind of critical theory still has a long life, let's say, in front of it. In any case, the kind of renewed thinking, thought, which we see emerging from many parts of the global South, let's say, give us hope that theory has not yet reached its end. Now, and it's part of what I try to do in Brutalism. Now, to properly attend to these questions I have just referred to properly attend to them somewhat forces us to refocus our attention on some of the broad historical processes. Eugene mentioned a few, some of the mega processes, and that have an almost overwhelming bearing on what humanity and the planet we live on, might become. And these mega processes I have called brutalism. In fact, I was building on the term's origins in a mid-20th century architectural movement. Some of you are aware of the existence of brutalism as mostly referring to that architectural movement. So I was building on the term's origins in this architectural movement, and I have defined brutalism as a contemporary process whereby power is constituted, it is expressed, it is reconfigured, it acts, and it reproduces itself as a geomorphic force. Through processes that include fracturing and fissuring, emptying vessels, drilling, expelling organic matter. In a word, by what I term depletion. Indeed, if we are to believe the most recent studies of the trajectories of the Earth system, we may well be fast approaching a threshold beyond which the Earth might be irreversibly turned into a hothouse. Now, in the strict sense of the term, a hothouse is not only unfit for human habitation. I keep coming to that question of habitation, habitability, and its opposite, and inhabitability. So hothouse, the sense of a house unfit for habitation, human and non-human, or one in which many cannot dwell. I borrow the concept of dwelling here from Heidegger. They cannot dwell, or for that matter, breathe. I can't breathe. It is also a house incapable of sustaining any form of life. A house, I keep using that term house, which is also a Heideggerian term, not only, but to a large extent, he used it in any case. A house where the human body, which after all is arguably the last thing each of us owns or is supposed to own, will be cooked to death from inside out in an endless process of radiation, of calcification, of petrification. I insist, let's say I'm interested in these issues in exactly the terms I have put it a moment ago for a number of reasons. One has to do with the ways in which the question of life, the politics of life, forms of life, life forms, the ways in which for a long time the human race, here I'm bringing yet another, one would say, outdated term. The human race has been concerned, let's say, with how life emerges, its spatial distribution, the conditions of its evolution, its resilience. This has been a key object of critical inquiry for a very, very long time. And a key dimension of our understanding, or in any case, the ways in which we have problematized the political. Then, of course, I mean, we debated on whether life emerged in warm or cold little ponds, or in hot hydrothermal vents. All of that might no longer really matter. Whatever the case, there is nowadays, let's say, near agreement that life emerged, let's say, life as such is rather built into the chemistry of the universe itself. That's what we learn from sciences, we learn that it is not simply an energy or a set of properties. We learn that it is in and of itself an activity, that it did not passively adapt to pre-existing environments, that it in fact modified them, it modified itself in the process, so much so that environments changed life forms, just as life forms changed the environments. We know that now. There is also a near agreement that life has the ability to replicate itself. It has the ability to replicate itself while reducing its entropy at the expense of external sources. And this is a line of argument someone like Bernard Stiegler was pushing forward by the end of his life, drawing on earlier thought developed, especially in Russia, in the 30s and so on. What I mean by that is the importance we attach nowadays to the idea of life as something that is self-sustaining. Self-sustaining in a context in which the most abundant life form that is present on Earth is microbial life. So the question of microbes. In a context also in which complex life forms only represent, in fact, a small percentage of the total life of our planet. Complex forms of life requiring, as we know, the presence of, among others, liquid water. Question of water. Microbes, water. The fact being also that for their sustainability and durability, these complex life forms, let's say, they must be at a range of distance from a star, a distance within which radiation from the sun in particular can maintain water in liquid form, thus protecting it from either evaporation or freezing. So, water, and now the sun, radiation. It is true that the life in question has been mostly life on Earth, terrestrial life. We have been preoccupied with terrestrial life. I would like to suggest that a shift is underway. A shift is underway in a number of domains. For instance, the key question today is not simply about the ways in which various practices in human genomics are reshaping, for instance, the contours of medicine, of capital, of social formation. People like Nicholas Rose have taught us a lot in this domain. Sundar Rajan. A shift is underway not only in the sense that the entanglement of the global bioeconomy with intimate experiences of reproduction has been going on, just as the reshaping of populations futures by, I would say, a new liberal eugenics. A shift has been going on also in terms of female reproductive biology, for instance, being opened up to novel and profitable forms of surplus value. And therefore, in this post-eugenic, post-genomic age, the possibility of patenting life itself has contributed to recasting the relationship between biopolitics, necropolitics, and capitalism. And this is something we have to pay attention to, drawing on historical manifestations of this process. So to a large extent, permanent disruption, exposure to all kinds of risks, and death itself, social death, as Orlando Patterson has characterized it, in particular in the case of Black slavery in the Americas, in the New World. So social death, biological death, human and animal death are increasingly incorporated, that is owned, that is sold, that is integrated in complex architectures of control and partition. And here, a number of recent works show the way. I have in mind, for instance, something I was reading recently by Malin R. King and Eva Hayward, the result of their investigation of the impact of endocrine active substances on the reproduction and the sexual morphology in organisms. Very interesting work. Now, what Malin R. King and Eva Hayward highlight is the extent to which various organisms are experiencing increased rates of disease, cancer, loss of habitat. How, for instance, workers in developing nations are increasingly exposed to things like weed killers, insecticides, industrial chemicals, artificially produced hormones, and even medications that are banned in the rich countries of the global north. And in fact, worldwide, steroids and other chemicals are now found in materials as diverse as plastic bottles, as containers, as even dental materials, paper receipts, food tins, clothing, electronic devices, synthetic fragrances, cleaning products, and other cosmetics. Which makes it such that, of course, as a result of the changing nature of the ecosystems to which we belong with others, the air we breathe, or the water we drink, our organisms are becoming something else. It's becoming something else of our organisms is therefore a very important aspect of any problematization of life politics or the politics of life in our times. So in this new regime of distribution of chemical, of nutrient, of polluting matter, not only is life squeezed, but the old boundaries between what is inside and what is outside, those boundaries are being displaced. And I would argue the continuity, or even more so the inextricability between organisms and their environments is fast leading to the unfolding of an entirely new biology of this world, as well as new partitioning, new ways of partitioning of the earth itself. So these are some of the issues I examine in the book, Brutalism. So nowadays, I would then say, the core question is or must therefore be framed in terms of how complex forms of life can still be reproduced. How can they still be sustained, made more durable, preserved, and universally shared in the shadow of a potential biological catastrophe, or for that matter, cosmic catastrophe. Why do I say that? I say this because increasingly, human life as such is seen within the prism of other forms of life. We have to see it within that prism in any case. The prism of other forms of life, the prism of, let's say, the life of all living beings and things. It has to be seen from the perspective or the conditions under which it ends. When you look around, the question of how does life, complex forms of life end, is becoming one of the key philosophical, ethical, political, economic questions of our times. And it seems to me that it will be so during a huge part of this century. Now we look at time scales on the other hand. As a number of colleagues have mentioned. Here I have in mind in particular the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty. Timescales are reconfigured as probably as we come to the realization that all living beings and all living things are embedded in one another. As we come to the realization that, for instance, the human body is the environment for viruses. As we come to the realization that plant matter informs bacteria, which in turn inform animal cells in a kind of endless encounter with multiple forms of life. As a result, thus, the Earth history processes, especially those processes that outscale human sense of time, are becoming central in planet-centered thinking. And the emergence of this planet-centered thinking, at least in parts of the global south, is, it seems to me, a key event in the recent history of critical thought. Because critical theory has not always been planet-centered. If there is a key critique that has been articulated against classical critical theory, it's precisely that. It spoke in the name of the planet, while itself turning the back itself to authentic planet-centered thinking. So the critical theory of tomorrow will have to be planet-centered, or it will lose, how does Latour put it, it will run out of steam. But it won't run out of steam if indeed it embraces the planetary as its springboard, the springboard from which it unfolds. And this has serious consequences, epistemologically, methodologically. I don't have the time to go through them, but anyway, that's what I believe. Now, let me move to another point, which, let's say, Eugene asked me, offered to reread my own book in light of the key themes of his seminar. So what I think I was doing, the other thing I think I was trying to do in the book, had to do with a key interrogation that has been central to at least, what we call the Black radical tradition, kind of thinking which has put at its center the question of what it means to inhabit the world as a Black person. A long tradition in which the likes of Du Bois, the likes of Fanon, the likes of Angela Davis, Sylvia Wynter, You mentioned, Eugene, you mentioned Ruth Gilmore, people like Françoise Vergès, and a number of others have been key interlocutors. And of course, since we're talking about the question of planetary habitability, Edouard Glissant, Maryse Condé, the list is very, very long. So the question of what the requisites for life actually are, of what it means to be alive. So it's a question, when I talk about the becoming black of the world, it's a question that is no longer simply reserved to blacks. It's a question which more than blacks do face nowadays. And that will be the case increasingly as capital, and that's what I want to comment on now, increasingly turn out to be what I call a magnetic field. That we have to rethink the concept of capital or capitalism in this age of combustion of the world, in this age of radiation, in this age of increasing radioactivity. We now have to think about capital and capitalism as a magnetic field. Now, when I say capital or capitalism as a magnetic field, of course I'm referring to the factors which underpin the transformation of the market in our times as probably the most powerful force on earth. I'm referring, of course, to the emergence not only of techno-molecular forms of colonialism, but I also have in mind the fact that the emergence of capitalism as a magnetic field and the emergence of techno-molecular forms of colonialism, both factors are underpinned by the unprecedented consolidation of power and knowledge in the hands of private high-tech corporate entities whose sphere of action is not at all one country or one region, but the earth as such. And I keep coming back to this concept of the earth with capital E, which in my mind is not exactly the same as the globe, which is more encompassing, which has, if you want, a cosmic dimension, which, let's say, speaks to a totality that, let's say, has to do with the universe as such. Because, mind you, the concept of the cosmos, the idea of the cosmic, the idea of the universe is the object of a rediscovery, not necessarily in the humanities, but in the hard sciences. And we really have to ask that question. Why is it that some of the key, let's say, objects of inquiry, which were somewhat the domain of the humanities, how come they have now been captured, colonized, and redeployed by other disciplines? So, corporate sovereignty, it seems to me, of course, has taken new forms, has been there in history. Think, for instance, of the English East India Company with its dominance of the Indian subcontinent in the 18th century. By the way, it's raining now outside. I just hope that it won't affect our communication. But if I disappear suddenly, it will be because of the rain. But let's hope it won't happen. But whatever the case, the point I want to make is the following. The conditions that have made possible the expansion of privatized government and the increasing patenting of species and the patenting of life itself in the first half of the 21st century, those conditions, of course, we know what they are. Of course, many have to do with the various legal frameworks behind international trade agreements, behind foreign investments, treaties, other mechanisms that have turned, as I was saying, markets into the most undisputed forces of our times. We know that. We also know that markets are not only shaping our environment in the form of information transfer, they have triggered a whole range of co-evolutionary dynamics and have opened the way to novel forms of, let's just call it, extended social metabolism. We see it here, especially those of us living in those parts of the world still dominated by an economy of extraction and of predation. Extraction of wealth, material wealth, predation over bodies, over minds, and so forth and so on. So as a result of the diversification of metabolic activity, I think that markets have morphed into complex extractive systems. I just said that. But not only complex extractive systems, they have also morphed into complex digestive systems capable of ingesting all living and dead beings and things, capable of turning them into waste. Necro-capitalism. So that's one set of conditions which lead me then to put forward this idea of capitalism as a magnetic field, as a way in which we can, at least from our historical experience in the South, renew our understanding of what exactly is it that we are facing. Now there are other such conditions, most of which have to do, I would say, with the evolution of knowledge and technology. In particular, the computational transformations of financial markets and the possibilities afforded by media technologies. Of course, others can be explained by, let's say, only by the radical changes in financial markets, instruments, and institutions. Whatever the case, these changes have deeply affected the interactions of the financial, or let's say the speculative, and the real side of economic systems. And in a context of heightened risks and uncertainty, fictitious capital now actively pursues different forms of rent. In the sense that extraction is not limited to raw material, data extraction has become a key dimension in production, in circulation, consumption processes, as well as in capturing value. So brutalism takes that dimension too, in the sense that capital and markets must now, as I have been trying to intimate, must now be understood as magnetic fields, as well as, by the way, key determinants of the climate system on Earth. I could go on and on this. Let's move on. I have already spoken for a long time. Let me try to come now to some kind of, not conclusion, but make space for let's say, a session, let's say, a dialogue, conversation, if you want. Let me end with a few quick comments on colonization, decolonization, or on colonialism, if you want. Because this is still, if it ever was, a key concept that can help to re-enchant critical theory for the times we live in. And here, let me say three quick things. First of all, historically, the expansion of colonialism had to do with the broader question of, let me put it like this, who does the earth belong to? This was, in fact, the key question underlying colonial conquest, imperial expansion since the 15th century. Now, what happened was that with the partition of Africa in the 19th century, European powers had decided that the earth in its entirety belonged to them. They were, if you want, its true owners. They could occupy lands that were populated by foreign people. They could exploit these lands, as well as the people who had always inhabited them, thereby carving out spheres of influence each of them had control over. So to a large extent, colonial expansion was a planetary project. although driven, of course, by, in large part at least, by national states, national business companies, but it mostly had to do with the reallocation of the Earth's resources and their privatization by those who had the greatest military might and the largest technological advantage. One who really understands this is Carl Schmitt in his Nomos of the Earth. He gets it exactly in the terms I have described it. So this is why, in its most historical sense, decolonization is by definition a planetary enterprise, a radical openness of and to the world, a deep breathing for the world, for the earth, as opposed to insulation. And this counts not only in politics, economics, but also theoretically. That critical theory has to be decolonized, which means truly planetarized, as opposed to insulation and provincialization. So that's the first comment on the dialectics of colonization, decolonization, as part of the effort to re-enchant critical theory for our times. The second quick comment has to do with the explicit kinship which did exist historically between plantation slavery, for instance, colonial predation, and contemporary forms of resource extraction and appropriation. And in each of these instances, I think there is a constitutive denial of the fact that we, the humans, co-evolve with the biosphere. We depend on it. We are defined with and through it, and we owe each other a debt of responsibility, of care, and of repair. Of course, there is an important difference which has to do with the technological escalation that has led to the emergence of computational capitalism in our times. By which I mean that we are no longer in the age of the machine, but in the age of the algorithm. Now, technological escalation, in turn, is threatening to turn us all into artifacts and to make redundant a huge chunk of the muscular power capitalism relied upon for a long time. So it follows that today, although its main target remains the human body, remains earthly matter, domination and exploitation are becoming increasingly abstract and reticular, and as a repository of our desires, emotions, dreams, fears, fantasies, our mind and psychic life have become the main raw material which digital capitalism, for instance, aims at capturing and commodifying. It also goes that colonization, that's the third and last comment, relied on racial subsidies. But the technologies of racialization have become ever more insidious, ever more encompassing, as the world becomes a huge data emporium. Tomorrow's technologies of racialization will be more and more generated and instituted through data, through calculation and computation, which means that racism is relocating. It is relocating both underneath and at the surface of the skin. It is reproducing itself via screens and mirrors of various kinds. It's becoming both spectral and fractal. So, this being the case, and I end now, what would it mean to decolonize? It would mean, among others, countering the dream of reducing knowledge to calculation by computers, for instance. It would mean investing in what I call a planetary library or a planetary curriculum. A curriculum whose project would be to make place for the incalculable and the incomputable, which would mean going beyond cognitivism, not because I'm against calculation or mathematics, not because I'm against computation, but because I believe that neither calculation nor mathematics nor computation are sufficient enough for explaining life. Because once we have done correct mathematics, we still need to determine what this exercise implies for the life of actual beings. Otherwise, in our end, we only have one world. We might dream about colonizing Mars or Venus or other unknown planets in the future, but for the time being, that is not part of our actuality. We only have one world, one solar system, and for this world to last as long as possible, and for this solar system not to calcinate life as such, we need to be a bit more intelligent and wiser. And this we will achieve if we understand that the earth is our shared roof and our shared shelter. And sharing this roof and shelter is the great condition for the sustainability of life on earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Achille. That was incredibly rich and expansive talk. I'm going to open the Q&A session by a couple of remarks and questions from myself. But as we start the discussion, please feel free to enter questions and comments in the chat box, and I'll put some of your questions to Achille in a few moments. Yeah, as I said, Achille, that was incredibly rich, and there are so many different points I could start from. But maybe I'll go from where you finished off on some of your points around decolonization. So you spoke a little bit about decolonization as entailing this idea that we foster the incalculable and the incomputable. And you speak quite a bit about this in the book. The book entails a kind of a another kind of critique of transparency, in the sense that, not just forms of knowledge, but as you kind of alluded to in the talk, forms of life are being reduced to a logarithmic logic or totally transparent logic that can be captured by techno-capitalism. And of course, this development in kind of what you call, necro-political capitalism is something that we can, take a lot of lessons from the Black radical tradition, because obviously this history relates to slavery and attempts to capture the entire being of a subject. But something you allude to quite a bit in your work is the idea of opacity. The idea that, the slaves were never entirely captured because there's something about humans that's kind of irreducible and it escapes total transparency. And of course, this is something that Edouard Glissant developed quite a bit, the idea of the right to opacity. And it's an idea that's very operative in contemporary theory. I think you could think of Saidiya Hartman, her book Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which talks about the kind of the lives of young Black women in early 20th century America as being characterized by this kind of opaque forms of life. And similarly, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, who talk about opacity against kind of logistical capitalism. And in your work, opacity is developed kind of, as you've been saying today, against kind of computation and against technological capitalism as well. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, about what that means to you as a kind of decolonial strategy or a critical strategy today.
As you yourself said, let's see, I don't remember whether I used the term opacity in brutalism. Or if I do, it is, as you said, in relation to the necessity we find ourselves right now in articulating a new critique of technology. A critique of technology that would hopefully build on, for instance, what the likes of Heidegger did, but would go beyond it. It would build on it, in particular in that part of Heidegger's work where he deals with precisely the concept of the incalculable. It would go beyond Heidegger in the sense that the technological in the Heidegger's age, let's say the most accomplished figure of the technological is still the machine. Although here and there in Heidegger, they are references to the emerging domain of cybernetics, but cybernetics is really in its infancy when Heidegger deals with this matter. Whatever the case, it seemed to me in brutalism that this age of ours, contrary to the age of Black slavery, plantation slavery, of which Fred Moten or Saidiya Hartman are preoccupied with, this age is one characterized by, I would say, a shifting distribution of powers between the human and the technological. In the sense that technologies are moving towards general intelligence. General intelligence, but also self-replication. And I don't think that this is something which preoccupies Sadia or Fred to the extent it does to me. I mean that over the last decades, we have witnessed, of course, the development of algorithmic forms of intelligence. And these algorithms have been growing in parallel with genetic research and often in its alliance, to the point where the integration of algorithms and big data analysis in the biological sphere does not only bring with it a greater and greater belief in techno-positivism and modes of statistical thought. I think it also paves the way for regimes of assessment of the natural world and the human world. It paves the way for modes of prediction and analysis which treat life itself as a computable object. And that's what I'm really interested in. And the forms of racialization, these, let's say, renders possible. Because concomitantly, algorithms inspired by the natural world and ideas of natural selection and evolution, they are on the rise. Such is the case, for instance, with genetic algorithms, the belief in any case being that that everything today is potentially computable and predictable. If it is potentially computable and predictable, it means that it is transparent or has to be made transparent. But such a belief can only hold if in the process we reject the fact that life itself is an open system. It's a nonlinear system. It is exponentially chaotic. So that's what I mean. Now, how does this correlate with Glissant's concept of opacity? Or how does it speak to Afro-pessimist notions of fugitivity? I really haven't thought about that much, but now that you asked the question, it's time for me to go and attend to it a bit more carefully.
You develop a really interesting series of reflections on the relationship between opacity and fugitivity in a conversation in theory and culture and society from a few years ago. It's just kind of sparking my memory, but that's maybe for another conversation for another day, because there's a lot of really interesting questions coming in at the moment in the chat box. So I might start putting questions to you from others, if that's okay, Achille.
Yeah, that's fine.
I've got two that I might put together because they're related to questions of temporality. So the first one is a relatively short question from Taylor Woods. And Taylor asks, what do you think is the best periodization of the worldwide turn towards brutalism? For example, do you associate it with specific events or time periods, such as the post-1973 economic crisis, or the rise of the personal computer, or the fall of communism, etc.? Is it possible to quantify a kind of historical turning point? And then if it's not too much, I might just leave a second question with you as well, because Jack Frost has a question on temporality. She says, thank you so much for this incredible talk. With respect to the planet-centered approach, I'm wondering how the temporal scale of repair needed to confront the mega processes of planetary uninhabitability might interact with or contradict the philosophies of time and history used by the tradition of revolutionary thoughts, whether it be linear or multiple, plural, etc. How might the temporalities of human resistance and social transformation that were used historically be modified to approach a scale beyond human time? Or what is the relationship between revolutionary time and life futures, or the future of freedom on the scale of the planet? So a long, rich question. I don't know if you can see the chat box, Achille. It might be helpful if you can read it as well.
Yes. Yes, I agree that these are two extremely rich questions. I won't be able to answer them. I will just try to think with them. To some extent, both raise the question of time, of multiple scales of time. As far as the first question is concerned, I had the feeling or the intuition that when we inhabit, as has been the case for some time now, multiple scales of time, this renders rather complex or complicated the ways of narration. It becomes very difficult to pinpoint, for instance, what the origins are, or to place issues in the kind of linear trajectory we have been used to, the tripartite division between the past, the present, and the future. So in brutalism, not that I avoid entirely the important question the colleague who spoke first is raising, but the intuition was that I would try to put, let's say, I'm trying to translate, it's getting late, and I think in French and try to translate in English, to insist on a number of big and small ruptures taken or identified in the technological realm. I really try to take technology as such as not only the theater of some of the most important transformations of our time, but also as a historical actor in and of itself. I don't know whether you are following what I'm trying to say. It's not just the scene, la scène. It's also, to use the usual term, an active agent of history, of historical transformations. So I had in mind, for instance, the extent to which, for instance, the world we inhabit, when did we begin to understand it as the world as just a vast field of data awaiting extraction? Since when is it that we enter into an epoch where the world, which had all these many different meanings before, cosmic meanings, metaphysical, at what point is it that it becomes not only secularized in the sense that we abandon the gods behind us, but is understood purely and simply as a vast field of data awaiting extraction? Since when is it that critical reason, not whatever form of reason, because we know, I mean, the history of reason is extremely complicated. Reason carries a heavy baggage, especially when read from those parts of the world where it was weaponized, if you want. So since when, for instance, the role of critical reason and theoretical thinking, or for that matter, knowledge itself, is reduced to a mere collection of data and its analysis and its use by governments, military, bureaucracies, or corporations? So I was looking at that kind of time, the time of those shifts, the time of smart devices which constantly watch us, record us, harvest vast quantities of data, that time when every activity is captured by sensors, by cameras embedded in those devices. It seemed to me that this is what colonialism in the 21st century is all about, techno-molecular colonialism. So I was interested in that specific time, the time when colonization takes a techno-molecular form. And I gave some examples during the presentation, building on the work done by other colleagues. So this question of extraction, of capture, of commodification, including of human capacity for thought, dismissal of critical reason in favor of programming, our being surrounded by multiple and expanding wave fronts of calculation, it seemed to me that that's where the rupture lied. And that's what I was interested in pursuing. So that's for the first question. The second is even more complicated and yet absolutely crucial if we are to begin to think about what to do. You see, I haven't made much progress in that sense. I'm still at a phase where I'm trying to make sense of what actually is going on. What are we up against? We are up against a process whereby techne is becoming the quintessential language of reason, which is a very serious matter. It is a serious matter because at least from a theoretical point of view, our imaginary of revolution, our imaginary of freedom, our imaginary of the good life, of happiness, all of this has for a long time relied on the idea of reason, that we would be free if and when we would be able to exercise that faculty in public, collectively, in our deliberations, even for those who believed that democracy was the last frontier of the possibility of freedom on earth, started from the assumption that democracy required for its sustenance, for its cultivation, for its defense, the deployment of reason in public. Now, if indeed techne is becoming the quintessential language of reason, its only legitimate manifestation, if now instrumental reason, or if you want, reason in the guise of techne, is increasingly weaponized, then where does that leave us? Where it leaves us is, let's say, what we witnessing is whether we see it or not, is the emergence of an entirely new species of humans. That's the proposition I want to make. It is not at all the human of the Renaissance for those whose Renaissance is a key marker of history. It's not at all the human of the 18th century, for those for whom the 18th century is the moment when they really emerge to light, or enlightenment for that matter. It's not even the human of the early or mid 20th century. It is an entirely different species of human, which is coupled with its object. In the sense that the distinctions we used to make between the human and the object, which was at the basis of all of our theories of emancipation, they relied on the fact, the staunch belief that a human being was not an object, and that everything had to be done to make sure that that never happened. With the exception, of course, of black slaves who were imagined as combining both properties. But now, if you allow me a moment of irony, now everyone is somewhat of a black slave in the sense that we are definitely coupled with our objects. Now, whether that means that we are human and objects at the same time, that's another matter. But nowadays, there is no human being without, let's say, our environment is not only saturated with all kinds of devices, it's, in fact, we spend most of our lives living with or through screens. So it seems to me that this experience has very serious implications in terms of our conception of time, our conception of resistance, conception of emancipation, of freedom, but also serious implications in terms of the new natures of cognition, in terms of how we perceive things and reality itself, in terms of what it is that we know or must know, how we know what we know, the distinction between fact and fiction, matter and substance, if indeed what we are witnessing is the monopolization of thought within technical infrastructures. So that's where the point where I am. I haven't gone further than that, but accept that the question is one that we have to attend to.
Thanks, Achille. Maybe some questions related to the topic of animism might be another way of approaching this issue. So there's the question from Ananya Kabir, who takes up your phrase, capitalism as a magnetic field, that you used during the talk. It says, your talk is reminding me of Black Panther, I think the Black Panther film's vibranium of West African animist cosmogonies. It seems to me you're trying to melt certain ontological distinctions between different categories of matter to fuse into being a new theoretical approach to the state we find ourselves in. The neo-animist approach is also reclaiming Gaia/Earth as the force through which to harness capitalism as a magnetic field. These are musings. Would love you to respond, dear Achille. And maybe just to tag on to Ananya's question, a comment from Katie, which is a little bit related. Katie Tidmar says, kind of related to this question, I'm wondering what you think about the role of affect and spirituality, or even magic, as opposed to hegemonic forms of reason, especially in thinking through the incalculable or the opaque, and their place in decolonial work.
Okay. So thank you, Ananya. Ananya is a very good friend of mine, so I'm happy to know that she is behind the screen. And she puts on a table a question I have been interested in, that of animism indeed. For those who are not familiar with the concept, it's taken from anthropological theories of the late 19th, early 20th century. And in the work of the likes of Tyler, animism is a number of things. It is a state of mind, in the long history of human evolution. It is a phase in the long history of evolution, a phase during which humans have not yet emerged to the life of reason, if you want. They are still in their infancy, in the sense that they impute causality to matters and entities which, from a purely rational point of view, have nothing to do with what is actually happening with, if you want, the event. So it's a state of disjunction between the event and its treatment by human faculties. The event happens to be treated by our most inferior faculties rather than by the superior faculty of reason. And therefore we believe, for instance, that a stone can produce this and that. We take for gods what pertains to fiction. We are confused, if you want. We're confused, but in an almost innocent manner. Innocent in the manner of children. But the moment we abandon our state of childhood, the childhood of the mind, then we replace animism by other modes of explaining life, the universe, causality, and so forth and so on. So, according to that anthropological tradition, the difference between us and primitive people who remained animists is that we exited our state of childhood, but they didn't. So animism is, if you want, the quote-unquote religion of those who haven't grown up, those who have remained ensconced in a permanent state of childhood. So that's more or less the history of the term, if you want. But there is a different set of significations which can be attributed to the term. In the sense that the term is illustrative of the existence of different types of ontologies, in the sense that it is illustrative of different modes of cognition which do not necessarily rely on the foundational dichotomy between the subject on the one hand and the object on the other. Different metaphysics, if you want, which have been elicited, of course, by those working, for instance, on equatorial Africa, on Amazonia, and so forth and so on. So a much more efficacious type of ontology in which the starting point is the recognition of what Latour, for instance, calls redistributed agency. The recognition that, we are not really the only humans, not the only ones, the only inhabitants of the earth. And that agency, stricto sensu, is not our monopoly, our sole our prerogative. In fact, we share it with multiple other, he calls them actants, so call them whatever you want. It also, animism, the concept, allows us to articulate a different, possibly, a different theory of emancipation. If only because, in this case, the assumption is not necessarily that the subject is different from the object. the subject has to control the object. It's something else. It's an ontology, as in the case of Africa in particular, that has to do with the compositional dimension of history, existence, and so forth and so on. The relational dimension of. You see, when you read Western philosophy, it's always, I mean, a huge part of it, classical Western philosophy, now I'm really being wild, forgive me. But one can argue that the bulk of Western philosophy moves constantly between, on the one hand, being, the question of being, and the rest. In the sense, okay, being and time, for instance. Being and time, that's Heidegger. Sartre writes more or less around the same kinds of things. It's always the question of ontology. The question of ontology precedes everything else. But if we draw on other archives, some of which are just as deep as the quote-unquote Western archive, we have an entirely different configuration. In Africa, it's about composition and relation. The key philosophical questions have to do with relationality, if you want, compositionality, meaning the ways in which we make space for a multiplicity of beings and things and entities, and we pay attention to the multiple manners in which they are brought together in projects, quote unquote, which most of which have to do with the business of being alive, of maintaining life, of curating life, of repairing it, of taking care of it, and in so doing, of allowing the earth to breathe. So it has to do with matters of breathing, matters of respiration, rather than matters of control, of matters of putting things into a hierarchy and so forth and so on. So look, you make me, might sound like a divagation, but it's because the concept of animism revisited and read from the point of view of alternative archives might allow us to relativize what otherwise in Western metaphysics looks like a drama. Now, the last point was, yes, of course, it also helps in attending to questions of affect and what you call spirituality, the incalculable and the incomputable. I don't know what else to add on that, but clearly there is a potential in taking seriously, let's say, in pluralizing our archives, there is a possibility indeed of thinking beyond the cul-de-sac, according to which everything is calculable or everything has to be made computable.
Thanks, Achille. I realize it's getting late, so maybe could I put to you maybe one final question to kind of conclude the discussion? So maybe as a final question, I'd like to ask something a little bit about how you write about the relationship between race and class in your books. And here I'm thinking of, at the beginning of the critique of Black reason, and this is kind of slightly tangential point to conclude, but I think an important point that you develop in Brutalism. At the beginning of the critique of Black reason, you talk about how once upon a time, the drama of exploitation was, the proletariat in the face of capital. And now the tragedy of the multitude today, you say, is that they're unable to be exploited and they're kind of abandoned subjects or superfluous to humanity. So you take this up in Brutalism, this idea of superfluous or surplus populations. And something that's really interesting, I think, that you do in Brutalism is you describe particularly migrants and refugees from Africa to Europe. You describe them as a racial class. And I'd like to know what you were thinking behind that, because that makes me think of a lot of interesting debates going on at the moment. I think of Alain Badiou, who has this critique of Derrida and hospitality, because he says that despite good intentions, it sometimes reinforces a distinction between those who are welcoming and those who are being welcomed. So Badiou wants to talk about a kind of nomadic proletariat. What you described as well kind of echoes a little bit how Marx and Fanon thought about class, but it feels like you're really updating these insights in very different ways in terms of how to theorize class in the 21st century, the situation of undocumented migrants as a racial class. So I think that's a really fascinating development in the book, if you'd like to comment a bit about that.
It's a complicated issue. I say all of what you read, let's say behind what you quoted is in fact what I hope to be even not a complex analysis, but at least a set of critical observations. Maybe it might be useful to share, if only for the quotation to make sense or to be accurately disputed. You see, part of what strikes me in the current moment is the kind of, let me just call it the dialectics of entanglement and separation, which is embedded in these times we live in the sense that all over the world, the combination of fossil capitalism, of warfare, the saturation of the everyday by computational technologies, and the ongoing destruction of habitats and milieus of life. All of this, I think, has led to a new redistribution of the earth, or in any case, it is illustrative of the ongoing fight about how to redistribute the earth, how to partition the earth, how to bring about a new nomos of the earth. And how to make sure that, how to decide about who are the inhabitants of this new nomos of the earth, who are the legitimate inhabitants, meaning those who can make a legitimate claim on owning it in one form or the other. The second thing which strikes me is the extent to which, in any case, in those parts of the world we live in, the extent to which to be alive or to remain alive is increasingly tantamount to being able to move. And I see it in the most blatant way. I've seen it during the time of the confinement here for reasons of COVID-19. The moment you decide that people must be confined in the name of protecting the life of the many, what you are doing is that you are condemning to either hunger or death a huge chunk of the population which cannot make it from today to tomorrow if they cannot move, if bodies are not next to each other, trying to eke something on an everyday basis. So mobility or forced immobility, forced immobilization becomes a weapon in resolving the struggles I alluded to, redistributing the earth. So maybe more than at any other time in human history, we find ourselves not only in close proximity to each other, but also exposed to each other. And what strikes me is that this close proximity and exposure is experienced, I think, less and less as an opportunity and possibility, and more as a heightened risk. But the drive is also towards contraction. It is towards containment, it is towards enclosure, and various forms of encampment, various forms of detention and incarceration. As a Black person, this question of incarceration, whether one is living in the United States of America or elsewhere, this question of forced immobilization, of never ever being able to move except in chains, that is a fundamental question. And typical, of course, of this logic of contraction, of containment, of incarceration, of enclosure, is the worldwide erection of all kinds of walls, fortifications, gates, and cliffs. There's practices of partitioning of space, of offshoring, of fencing of wealth, splintering territories, fragmenting spaces, the renewed infatuation with borders, which themselves are used either to decelerate movements, to stop it in some instances, for certain classes of populations, all in the name of managing risks, providing security, or preserving one's identity, and so forth and so on. But this goes, and of course, this is becoming more and more digitalized. The practice of borderization are becoming more and more digitalized. Databases, filing systems, devices, sensors, drones, satellites, sentinel robots, infrared detectors, you name it. The point is what? The point is, what do we do? It's all in response to one question, two questions. First, to whom does the earth belong? Two, what do we do with those we believe are not ours, don't belong, are after us, and in any case, don't add anything to who we are or what we want to be. And in fact, we would be absolutely better without them. So what do we do with those we declare to be superfluous? How do we govern them? Where do we put them? And this question has been with us for a long time. It's only now taking different forms, more lethal. How do we get rid of them? So we get rid of them in many, many different ways. We put them in jail, incarceration. Ruth Gilmore and many others have been talking about that. In order to put them in jail, of course, we need to set up the judicial system against them, police brutality in particular, or we govern them through abandonment. So government by a total relinquishing of any kind of responsibility whatsoever in relation to what they become, to their lives. So it seems to me that in fact, part of what we are witnessing is the sophistications of forms of abandonment, government by abandonment, as a way of segregating between discounted bodies on the one hand and insured bodies, those which benefit from insurance against the multiplication of risks on our planet. So that's how I see it. That's what led me to make the comment you quoted. But since this is the end, I don't want to end on that sad note. I want to end with what I said early on, that we only have one world, in any case so far. I want to end with the idea that part of what planetary thinking, centered thinking, forces us to do is not simply to draw on multiple archives and all that. That's important. It also forces us to revisit what we mean by the in common. It forces us to revisit the concept of the in common as that which does not exist in and of itself, as that which is to be composed. This question of composition, of the compositional, is absolutely key to reopening an imaginary which might allow us to think beyond difference. For most of the 20th century, the question of difference and otherness has been at the core of traditions of progressive emancipatory thought, and for all kinds of reasons, most of them legitimate reasons. I submit that in view of what I started with, the two questions I started with, that of planetary habitability and that of life futures, the futures of reason and freedom, if indeed these are the key challenges critical thought is facing in this century, then it might be time to, let's say, pay attention to the idea of the in common. How? That will be the subject of the next lecture if Eugene invites me again. Thank you.
Most definitely. We'd love to have you back, Achille. Okay, maybe I'll bring things to a conclusion there. So first of all, thanks very much to everyone for attending and for all your questions, and apologies I didn't get through all the questions. There were some really interesting ones I didn't get a chance to ask, I'm afraid. Can I just say thanks to Eric Erdl for setting up the events and providing technical support at ULIP. And of course, thank you so much, Achille, for a really rich and stimulating talk. Thank you for your time, and thank you for extremely generous responses to a difficult set of questions as well. We'll be continuing this series, as I mentioned. The next is with Deborah Cowan at the end of January. So if you keep an eye on the ULIP website, I'll be posting details about that event in the coming week. Otherwise, have a good weekend, and look forward to seeing some of you online for the seminar again soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.